Hey everyone, my name is Josh Matlock. For those of you who don't know me, I am a senior data analyst in the healthcare industry with 8 years of experience, and today I'm going to be answering your questions about the work that I do and how to get a job in my industry. Thank you so much for submitting these questions on my channel. I will get through as many of these questions as I can, and I'll also try to answer a wide diversity of questions to cover as much ground as possible, but I apologize in advance if I didn't get around to answering your specific question. All right, so our first question is, hi Josh, are presentations and public speaking required specifically in the healthcare data analyst role? The answer is, it depends. Some places might have some expectation that you do presentations with large groups of people, but mostly I have worked in places where I had to speak with one person or two people max. Actually, in my current job, I do a lot of this where I just meet with small groups individually. I ask them questions about what the analytical needs are, and then I help them with that. For example, I once had a project where I had to figure out a way to create a query that identifies patients that had dialysis and that are actively getting dialysis. And I had to stratify that by the different types of dialysis, like hemodialysis and peritoneal dialysis. And so I had to meet with a group of two people that managed the dialysis unit, and I had to ask them a bunch of questions like, where do we even document this in our electronic medical records system, which is Epic? Or how do we know the difference between hemodialysis and peritoneal dialysis? Are there different billing codes, for example? I would have meetings with them where I'd get some of these details clarified, and then I would use that information to build something in SQL. Then I'd plug that into a dashboard and share my work with them and have them validate that. Typically, these are virtual meetings and they're pretty informal. We discuss all of the logistics, I take some notes, and I figure out where I can find that data in our database, and then I build the thing and I share what I've built with them. And then they might ask questions at that point about how I configured the reports or how I define certain metrics, and so on and so forth. I would say that this is the typical experience that I and other data analysts have. I don't usually do PowerPoint presentations. Usually the thing that I'm sharing is the work that I built, and usually I'm a lot more comfortable speaking about that after I've developed the thing because I've spent so many hours on it by that point that I can just about answer any question that they have about it. I'd say the only stressful thing is sometimes I'll be asked a question that I don't know the answer to at the top of my head, but in those cases I always just say, that's a good question. I will look into that and get back to you. I don't think there's ever been an occasion though where I've had to do like a really formal presentation where I've had to get into a suit and tie or some formal attire and present in front of a PowerPoint screen in front of a bunch of people. Most of the time it's just meeting with a small group of business partners and maybe some doctors. I'm just sharing a dashboard that I built and describing the process that I took when I built it and answering the questions that they have about that work. And by the time you've built that thing, you're usually very knowledgeable about it. If you have some anxiety about doing those first presentations with your stakeholders, just know that you got hired into this role because people believe in you and they believe in your analytical abilities, and you can always practice leading up to that presentation. You can practice in front of your significant other, your cat, you can practice in front of a mirror. Just practice and I promise it will get easier. Next question is, what tech tools do you use for clinical data analysis? Primarily, I use SQL, Tableau, and to a lesser extent, Power BI. Sometimes I'll use Excel, but not very often. First, I'll use SQL to wrangle the data. And I've used a lot of different dialects of SQL. Currently I use BigQuery, which is part of the Google Cloud Platform. I've also used Netezza, which is an IBM-based product. I've used Snowflake, SQL Server Management Studio. And once you've learned one dialect of SQL and you've gotten pretty good at it, it's pretty easy to learn the other dialects. Tableau I've been using since 2015, and it's my data visualization tool of choice. Sometimes I'll use Power BI as well. And the data visualization tool that you use is really going to depend on the company or the organization that you work for. Some places only prefer Tableau, other places will only prefer Power BI. Some places, like my current work, use both. I have found also that REDCap is used quite a lot in the healthcare industry. REDCap is a surveying tool that's used in research where you can build your own forms. people enter data into those forms, and then you can intake that data into Tableau or R or Python or SQL. You can do statistical analysis with it. You can design surveys that are given to patients, and you can do longitudinal studies on your patients. The problem with REDCap, though, is that much like Epic, you can't really learn on REDCap unless you work for a company that already has it. So that is one tool that I use that's pretty specific to healthcare and academic environments. Another tool I use is Epic. Epic is a massively popular electronic medical record system, which is based in Wisconsin, and it's used to document all of our patient information. So someone comes into the hospital, they sprain their ankle, there's going to be a doctor somewhere typing some notes into that patient's chart about how they treated the patient. And someone else is going to be entering in medications that are going to be administered for that patient. Medical coders are going to be in there reading the notes and rendering certain diagnosis codes for the encounter. There might be a scheduler on Epic that's going to input data about when they should see their doctor next. There's all kinds of people that are going to be entering data into the medical record, and it's just a treasure trove of information for all of our patients. And it's kind of a central place where we can get all of our data. Epic is also capable of generating reports. So some of these reports are called slicer dicer, radar dashboards, and reporting workbench reports. Sometimes analysts will be asked to build reports in these environments rather than building it in Tableau or Power BI. So there is a lot that Epic can do. Next question is, what stakeholders will you be communicating with as a healthcare data analyst? What is interacting with them like, and what do you usually report to them? In my current job, me and other data analysts are each sort of subject matter experts. So I specialize in neurosciences, and previously I did dialysis. I have another colleague who specializes in cancer and blood disorders, and yet another colleague who specializes in psychiatric medicine. I have lots of other data analyst colleagues who each have their own subject matter that they're responsible for. Typically what will happen is I will have weekly meetings with my neuroscience business partners. So I meet with the director of neurosciences, and there's also a manager of the seizures department. And I meet with the two of them and they describe their analytical needs. So in each meeting I say, here's the work that I have on my plate, and based off of what you are requesting, here's how soon I should be able to get around to this. And in my experience, usually these stakeholders are very appreciative of data analysts and are very pleasant to work with. They aren't always very data savvy necessarily. And so it's up to us to help those stakeholders understand what you can and can't do with the data when they give you a certain request. And also telling them how soon you think you can get certain features in your report completed by. Usually there will be like 3 stages in the development of the report when you're meeting with your stakeholders. Step 1 will be gathering all of the requirements for the thing that you're building. Step 2 is once you've built the thing in SQL, you present the data to them and ask for their help in validating it to make sure that it's accurate. And then step 3 is after you've built that data and you've gotten it validated and you've plugged it into Tableau or Power BI, you show them that report and then you get their feedback on the way that it looks in Tableau or Power BI. Does it look and feel good? Are they able to interact with it and understand what's going on? Do they like the graphs that they're seeing? So to give you an example, I had a report that I had to build where I was first gathering the details about what I needed. And it was building a report in the neurosciences department that looks at the different backlogs of appointment requests that need to be scheduled. And how long have they been sitting in a queue waiting to be scheduled for an appointment? So I'd gather information from them like, can you give me an example patient so I can figure out where that data lives in our database? Or what kind of metrics do you want me to build and how do you want me to define them? Or do we want this data stratified by different areas? We decided that we would stratify it by the different subspecialties of neurosciences like neurofibromatosis, seizure, tuberous sclerosis, multiple sclerosis. I ended up developing this data extract that would stratify all these different subspecialties of neurosciences and show how many appointments were sitting in a queue that needed to be scheduled. I measured how long they're sitting there for. Usually my meetings with these stakeholders are pretty informal and small, so I'm not dealing with a large group of people very often, unless the project is a very large one that is a huge dashboard with C-suite people that are involved that are going to be looking at that report every day, in which case there might be many people involved. But that does not happen very often for me. Sometimes I'll be working with actual doctors or physicians and they want me to gather some data so that they can statistically analyze it and present it to a medical journal. And I'd say like 95% of the time, the doctors that I've worked with are very cool people, very reasonable people, and usually those doctors are also very appreciative of any help that they can get, especially if you are assisting them with their research. Occasionally, I'll get doctors or stakeholders that might be a little abrasive or short-tempered, but it doesn't happen very often. So don't worry too much if you start getting involved with different doctors or have to build reports for doctors. So we have another question that says, do you need to know any medical coding? So for those of you who are unfamiliar with medical coding, that's basically a profession where someone is dedicated to scanning through a patient's medical records. And it might be a note about a patient who, let's say they came in with COVID and they had a high fever and they're having coughs. And when that patient comes into, say, the emergency room, a doctor will see that patient, they'll write up notes in the EMR system, and then a medical coder will look through those notes and they reference a code book that contains a bunch of different codes for different medical conditions. And they'll say, aha, this sounds like COVID. I'm going to put in an ICD-10 code that identifies this patient as having COVID in this encounter. And this is a very important job because those codes result in doctors and hospitals getting paid. And those codes also make it possible for a data analyst like us to pull up a list of patients that had a specific disease. Now, that being said, I have never been a medical coder, and I'd say that the vast majority of my colleagues that work in data analytics have not been medical coders either. So it's definitely not a requirement, but if you do happen to be a medical coder, that would definitely be a great advantage because you'll learn a lot of medical terminology in the process. The only thing you need to know about the coding concepts is that there are a variety of codes that are used in healthcare. The most important ones are ICD-10-CM, ICD-10-PCS, and CPT. ICD-10-CM are just the diagnosis codes for the patient. So if they had a sore throat, they might get a code for tonsillitis. If they had COVID, they get a code for COVID. Patients can have tons of ICD-10-CM codes, even within a single encounter. So they could be suffering from multiple problems at once, which will each require their own diagnosis codes. Patients can also get ICD-10-PCS codes, which are inpatient procedural codes. So maybe things like coronary artery bypass graft, or CABG for short. Those are major inpatient procedures that would be given ICD-10 PCS codes. CPT codes are more outpatient focused and would be things like, did this patient have a simple checkup? Or did the patient get a booster shot? Or did the patient receive dialysis? Or did they get diabetic counseling? The next question asks, since healthcare deals with sensitive info, do you only work in the office or do you work remotely? Well, you can do either, and it depends on the company that's hiring you. Some places are really strict about their employees working on site. Most places are pretty flexible about their employees working remotely though. Personally, I work remote and I was given an encrypted work laptop. So if someone were to steal it, they wouldn't be able to just get to the patient data. I also log in through a secure portal that allows me to access patient data in a safe manner. So working remote should not be a problem if you have a hospital that supports that technology, and most hospitals do. And I'll say that also, since COVID, hospitals and clinics have been a lot more lenient in letting data analysts work from home. Some companies will get really picky about having their employees work a couple times in the office every week because they spend a bunch of money renting out an office park and they want to use the most of their investment. I actually had a job like this in the past and I quit in favor of a job that did offer me 100% remote work. Next question asks, how much did my CPHQ certification help me in my transition into data analytics? So for those of you who don't know, CPHQ is a certification which stands for Certified Professional in Healthcare Quality. Now, the only reason that I have this certification is because before I was a data analyst, I had a 3-month stint where I was a quality improvement consultant within a hospital. CPHQ is a certification where you can take this test to demonstrate your knowledge of quality improvement principles in a healthcare setting. and it's offered worldwide. And there are courses and trainings that you can take to ace that exam. It's pretty expensive though to study for that certification. The trainings teach you things like the regulations of a hospital. So for example, knowing simple rules that you have to adhere to in a hospital, like if someone files a complaint, the hospital is required to issue a response to that patient within, I think, like 3 months or something like that. They test your knowledge about accreditation processes like the Joint Commission. They ask you about the theory behind working with teams and the practices that are most effective. They test you on your knowledge of quality improvement cycles like PDSA, the IHI model for improvement, Six Sigma, Lean, and there's a tiny nugget in there that is focused on data analytics, like knowing which graphs to use in certain situations or knowing what Pareto charts are used for. I would say that CPHQ certification was certainly helpful in getting me to understand what quality improvement consultants do in a hospital and being able to speak the same language when I'm working with them on a specific project devoted to the quality and safety. So it's definitely helpful, but given how expensive it is, I would say it's only really worth it if you can get your work to pay for it. If it were me and if I were doing this all over again, I'd probably be more focused on getting a Tableau certification or a Power BI certification. And I say that because whenever I go into an interview and I mention that I have CPHQ certification, 9 times out of 10, the person interviewing me will say, "What the heck is CPHQ certification? I've never heard of that." It can be nice though if you have an interview with someone that does work in the quality improvement area, but I'd say that it's not the most important certification in the world. Is it helpful? Yes, but the certification isn't specifically geared towards data analytics. That's just a tiny aspect of the certification. So I would say that there's better certifications out there for you. Next question is, what do you think recruiters value more, certification or a portfolio of projects? And I would say definitely a portfolio of projects. Having a portfolio is much more crucial to landing a job. I have never been in a job interview where I haven't shared my portfolio of work. And oftentimes nowadays, when you apply for a job and someone invites you to an interview, they're going to ask you to be prepared with a portfolio anyway. When you're in an interview, you're basically trying to convince the interview panel that you not only have adequate theoretical knowledge about the tools that you'll be using, but that you can also apply what you know about those tools to actually build something useful. So in order of priority, I would say start with your portfolio. And when you're applying for jobs, if your resume combined with your portfolio and your networking isn't enough to land you a job, then maybe start sprinkling in some certifications and see if that makes a difference. There's a question here that asks, how do you deal with imposter syndrome? So I would say that everybody gets imposter syndrome. It's this feeling that you're a phony, that you're not adequate enough to do the job. And I still get this sometimes, even after working as a data analyst for 8 years. But it gets easier as time goes on because you build more confidence in yourself. And there's a couple of things I like to keep in mind. If you're a data analyst, then you got hired into the role for a reason. People believe in you and your technical abilities. And as long as you maintain a good personality and you're open to feedback and you're always striving to do better, there is a very low chance that you're going to get fired for incompetence or something like that. Usually the people that I've seen let go are let go because they have some behavioral issues that they're working out. If you feel like you don't know enough, you can always watch YouTube videos to improve your knowledge of data analytics. You can practice in your spare time. You can practice writing SQL queries. You can practice improving your data visualization skills. You can seek out mentors that can help you maybe improve your soft skills, your ability to communicate with your stakeholders. At the end of the day, you just have to keep in mind that you're not going to be perfect at everything. But you can always strive to be better, and you can always be open-minded when someone gives you feedback about how you can do better. I will say that imposter syndrome is kind of at its peak when you're first starting out and you get your first job as a data analyst because you're putting a lot of pressure on yourself to succeed. And if you're like me, you're probably measuring yourself against a high standard, and that's totally normal. Just keep in mind that nobody is going to expect you to be a pro even after a year of doing the work. It took me like 2 years before I really started feeling comfortable doing what I do every day. What really helps me when I'm feeling stressed out is to clear my mind and go outside for a walk. Usually by clearing my mind, it helps me tackle the problem with a fresh brain, and I'm able to think of things that I hadn't been able to think of before because I was so stressed at the time. I also practice mindfulness meditation. There's a great app out there called Headspace that's good for this. It helps you live in the present moment rather than worrying about the past or the future. And that can also really help you deal with stress effectively. And my last thought on this is if you're just totally stuck on something and you just cannot figure it out on your own, don't try to do it on your own. There's people out there that want to help you, whether they're in your company or on Stack Overflow or Reddit. So if you are stuck, don't be afraid to ask for help. Next question is, networking is such a major role in landing jobs. Not knowing anyone in this field is detrimental. Do you have any recommendations on how to make these connections? I do have a video where I talk a little bit about this, and I'd recommend checking that out if you haven't already. But my recommendation in general would be try to think of anybody that you know that maybe either works somewhere in healthcare or that works with data. So you just need to work with one of those two criteria. If you know someone personally that works in any of those two areas, make sure that you're connected with them on LinkedIn. Then reach out to that person, tell them that you're networking and you're trying to learn more about data analytics in healthcare, and they might be able to speak to that subject directly. Or they might know someone that works in that area and they might be willing to make that introduction. Just phrase it in terms of you wanting to do an informational interview and that you're trying to launch a career in this field. But just make sure that you know that person personally. If you're just a stranger to somebody and you're connecting with them on LinkedIn and you're asking them a bunch of questions, they might not take too kindly to that. Informational interviews are a great way to learn about the job that you're pursuing, and it can also signal to the person that you're talking to that you're looking for a job and they might be able to help you. But just don't be too pushy about it. And then at the end of that informational interview, see if they can make any recommendations for anyone else that you can talk to, and then you can continue to weave your web of potential people that you can assimilate into your network. But that being said, it can be very difficult to start that process if you don't know anybody. So my advice would be to just start meeting people. Go volunteer somewhere. Volunteer at a hospital, volunteer at the Red Cross. It's a lot easier to build a network if you're already a student or someone working in the healthcare industry. So if you don't have those resources available to you, just try to get yourself out there and volunteer and meet as many people as you can. Ask them what they do for a living. Another great way to meet people is by going to various user groups like Tableau user group or a Power BI user group, because these venues are filled with people that work with data for a living. And there's bound to be someone there that works with healthcare data. When you sign up for these user groups though, just make sure that the venues are in person where you can meet people and not just virtual. Go to those sessions, try and learn as much as you can while you're there, and try to introduce yourself to people and strike up a conversation with them. That can be really tough though if you're introverted like me, but I promise that the effort is definitely worth it. And the last question I get asked all the time is, Josh, when is your data analytics accelerator course going to be ready? So I'd say it should be finished sometime in the fall. I'm just not sure when the exact date will be on that yet. I have a very specific vision for it. There's going to be 3 modules. There's going to be one module that deals with SQL, another in Tableau, and another that deals with networking and landing your first job. The first iteration of this class is going to be a beta test, so it's going to be a discounted class, but it's only going to be limited to 20 students maximum. And I'm starting with only 20 students because I want to smooth out all of the bugs that I might have in my class. And I want to improve this to the point where it will be free of any major bugs and it will be in a nice and polished format. All right, so that's all the time I have for today. Thank you so much for watching and submitting your questions. I'll see you in another video.